The next episode of this series is called Making the Midwest, Part 1. If you've been following along, then you're probably interested in understanding religion's role in shaping rural communities and how they look and behave today. I want to pause here to remind folks that rural and the rural identity is not a monolith. It's not a monolith by its people, its geography, or its ideology. While the things discussed in the previous episodes and probably the next few do lay a pretty good foundation to how our entire country as the United States was founded and how that led to the way that we think and we act and behave, as we start to move more forward in history, it's important to understand what local historical events were happening and what people lived in different localities to understand who they are and why certain things are happening today. So at this point, we are going to focus more on the Midwestern region, and we will eventually get to a point where we're really focusing more on Missouri and Illinois and the greater St. Louis region as a whole as we get more to today's policies. But for now, let's jump right in. While there are disputes over what the Midwest truly is, the Census Bureau defines it as 12 states, including Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, North Dakota, Ohio, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. I myself am an Illinois girly. Now, when we left off, we had gotten through to Manifest Destiny throughout the 1800s and stopped right around 1900. But as we jump into this video, we're actually going to go back to the American Revolution. Some of the causes of the American Revolution included the overextending of British royal power, including the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Act, and the Navigation Act, with the last one meaning that colonial goods could not be exported to different countries. They had to go to Britain first. This led to the very popular "no taxation without representation" phrase that we still hear and say today. Another cause included the Writs of Assistance, which was sent by Britain, and it gave British authority in the colonies to search private homes and seize property without any notice or reason. Sound familiar? Sound familiar? The next one we have is Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which was a pamphlet he wrote that argued for American sovereignty due to the increasing corruption of the crown. This sold over 500,000 copies in its first year, and for the mid-1700s, I'd say that's pretty good and pretty popular. Next, we have the Boston Massacre, which occurred on March 5th in 1770. And the Boston Tea Party that happened later, in which about 100 to 150 men destroyed over $1.5 million in tea in today's money. I think it's also important to note that the first man shot and killed in that attack was Crispus Attucks, who was a black man. Now, of course, we are deep in slavery at this time, so there was arguments over whether or not enslaved folks should be armed and allowed to help serve in the American Revolution, and there were some generals who did allow for enslaved folks to join their ranks and some who did not. But as the war ended and the Treaty of Paris is signed, the Constitution is created without any mention of black folks enslaved or otherwise in any capacity. The Three-Fifths Compromise was, came into law in 1787 during the Constitutional Convention, which said that enslaved people and their descendants would be counted as 3/5 of a vote. Thomas Jefferson, who famously owned and assaulted his enslaved folks, would have lost his 1800 election for president if it was not for this compromise. Now, the effects of the Three-Fifths Compromise were that Southern states gained more seats and increased their political power because of being able to count their enslaved population in this way. 3/5 of the enslaved population were used to calculate taxes that states would owe the federal government. It increased congressional power for the southern states, which was then used to block efforts to dismantle slavery. And it also concreted the legal status of enslaved folks and cemented the idea that we were not human and that we were property under the chattel slavery system. Now, as the young United States was trying to expand its power out west, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was created to help determine how expansion would happen, what it would look like, and who would have ownership of lands west of the original 13 colonies. So the Northwest Territory included what is now modern-day Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota. The indigenous tribes that lived there included the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, and the Ojibwe. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, which were put in place before the Constitution was officially created, Virginia laid claim to a lot of these Western territories, but smaller states like Rhode Island and Connecticut were against that and really pressed to have a stronger federal government to manage this United States geographic expansion. Native American and indigenous tribes were not given any legal authority over their own land. And this is also where, as we said in the last video, the leaders of the colonies really used religion to justify locking out indigenous populations from that authority, displacing them, taking over the lands, and in many cases, exterminating existing indigenous populations. Now, landowners such as George Washington, who also owned slaves himself, benefited from the Northwest Ordinance because a lot of folks were really interested in the Ohio Valley. It was a prime area that had so many different natural resources as well as fertile land to grow crops. As this ordinance takes hold and folks do start to move out west, this caused a rise in conflicts with existing indigenous tribes, which led to the Northwest Indian War in 1785 through 1795, and heightened efforts to displace or exterminate indigenous people. The Northwest Ordinance also strengthened the federal government's power, who used the territories to also avoid dealing with the issue of slavery and the question of how or whether or not it would remain legalized in certain areas. The Northwest Territories were not allowed to have enslaved folks. However, the institution of slavery was still protected in the original 13 colonies unless an individual state had written laws or written into their new constitutions that it would be outlawed. Now, slavery would be prohibited from the Northwest Territories up until the Missouri Compromise during the Louisiana Purchase in 1820. One stereotype I hear often is that the Midwest was a safe place for Black folks because it did not allow slavery within the Northwest Territory or what became the North during the Civil War. And I really want to push back against that because this decision to not allow slavery in the Northwest Territory was not at all because they thought that the institution of slavery was wrong or because they wanted to protect enslaved folks. It was a decision that was made to benefit the landowners who held huge tracts of land, like Thomas Jefferson, like George Washington, and like so many of the other folks who wrote the founding documents of this country, and who were involved in deciding who had power and who did not, and deciding who was human and who was not. The same folks that decided to not allow slavery within the Northwest Territory so they could get enough votes to allow their own personal property to expand were the same folks that decided Black folks were only 3/5 human. So let's not get that twisted, and join me for part 2 as we move into the Louisiana Purchase, the Missouri Compromise, and the Civil War.